I will go ahead and get us started here.
Mhm.
So hello, everyone. Welcome. As you can tell, this is a webinar format. And I'll go ahead and begin here. So good evening and welcome to this special webinar event, a lecture by Professor Ahmad Al-Jallad on Arabia before Islam, Gods, Languages, and Identities. My name is Muhammad Hassan Khalil, and I'm the director of the Muslim Studies program and a professor of religious studies here at Michigan State. I'd like to begin by thanking our various co-sponsors. In addition to the Muslim Studies program, the co-sponsors include the Asian Studies Center, Department of History, Department of Linguistics and Germanic, Slavic, Asian, and African Languages, Department of Religious Studies, Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, James Madison College, and Peace and Justice Studies. I'd also like to thank our administrative lead, Mary Firdausi, for setting up this webinar. And I also want to thank our student intern, Naila Ahmed, for helping to get the word out. So we're going to get right to it. And we are delighted to have with us Professor Ahmad Al-Jallad. Professor Al-Jallad is a philologist, epigraphist, and historian of language, and is currently the Sofia Chair of Arabic at The Ohio State University. His work focuses on the languages and writing systems of pre-Islamic Arabia and the ancient Near East, and has led several epigraphic surveys in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. His latest book explores Arabic's transformation as it crosses the pre-Islam divide. The title is The Damascus Psalm Fragment, Middle Arabic and the Legacy of Old Hijazi, or perhaps it's pronounced Higazi. And I will say that Professor Al-Jallad is truly one of the leaders in the field. So we are delighted to have him with us. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Al-Jallad.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalil. And I'd like to thank the Muslim Studies program at Michigan State University as well for this kind invitation and for your kind introduction. Thank you very much. Well, when you wrote me, I was very, very excited to talk about the subject that you proposed, which was pre-Islamic Arabia. But knowing that I only had 45 minutes or so to do that, and I guess the subject of pre-Islamic Arabia would take, I think, several semesters to cover, it was a bit challenging to figure out what exact angle I wanted to take to introduce your audience to this very exciting field, the field that's changing by the day as new discoveries come in. And so I decided, so you can see that the title of my talk here is a bit different from the one that I submitted. And I think that this image that the background here is an image I shot in 2018, I think it was, sort of captures captures the pre-Islam divide in the popular imagination. So what I wanted to do today is talk about pre-Islamic Arabia, or Arabia before Islam, but from the vista of the Quran. That is, using the Quran, using the Quran as a source for pre-Islamic Arabia and examining what the Quran says about pre-Islamic Arabia in light of archaeological and epigraphic discoveries. And this talk will cover peoples, gods, and cultures, rituals, and things of that sort. In the popular imagination, the divide between pre-Islamic Arabia and Islamic Arabia is sharp. It looks like this. This is the area of the basalt area in eastern Jordan where the Black Desert, the basalt desert, meets the Hamad, which is a mud sandy desert. And you can see it from space. It's a very sharp divide. And in the popular imagination, continuing with that, pre-Islamic Arabia, or the Jahiliyyah, as it's called, the age of ignorance, well, appears rather empty, devoid of civilization, inhabited by Arabian tribes wandering from pasture to pasture, engaging in feuds, and more or less cut off from the rest of the world from the beginning of time. Now, I said this is in the popular imagination. This isn't really the image we get in the writings of pre-modern, let's say, Muslim authors, folklorists, historians. For them, pre-Islamic Arabia was a very exciting place, but it was a place that sort of gave a setting, a context for Islam. They worked with a pre-Islamic Arabia, but without what we would consider reliable sources. They were working mostly with folklore and tales, stories, materials that were passed down as entertainment, garbled and fragmentary knowledge. And from this, they constructed various worlds, various pre-Islamic Arabias to entertain, to explain, and to educate, or for pedagogical purposes in some cases. That is the Jahiliyyah, and rightfully so. Many scholars today are skeptical of some of these stories, a pre-Islamic Arabia inhabited by giants and great heroes and filled with magical creatures, ancient tribes going back to the antediluvian period. Scholars are rightfully skeptical of this material. And so it is not uncommon to encounter a phrase like, for pre-Islamic Arabia, we simply have no sources. The history of Arabia sort of begins with the history of Islam. But in the 19th and 20th century, the picture starts to change as explorers discover archaeological sites, uncover inscriptions, monuments. Pre-Islamic Arabia moves from the world of fiction and mythology to a real place that can be interrogated, studied, examined. Pre-Islamic Arabia, the Jahiliyyah, actually becomes ancient Arabia. And so in this image here, you see the remains of ancient Marib, the capital of the Sabaean kingdom of ancient Yemen that goes back probably to the second millennium BCE. Inscriptions on the right of in ancient lost languages depicting magical scenes. This seems to be the tree of life with some winged bulls, amazing art. The earliest texts we have from ancient Arabia come in the form of these sticks that I show you here. These are inscribed sticks that in ancient South Arabia and ancient Yemen were used to record data for day-to-day documents, letters, contracts, receipts. And what's fascinating and fantastic about this kind of support written on wood is that you can carbon date the wood. And from these, we know that writing cultures in Arabia extend back to the early first millennium or even the late second millennium BCE. Arabia was far from being a unity, a landmass inhabited by one group of people, the Arab, by one who spoke one basic language, Al Arabiya, but rather was filled with diversity. In this small corner of Arabia here, ancient South Arabia, we had at least 4 major kingdoms, each with their own language, their own culture, their own deities. The ancient South Arabia, ancient Yemen can be considered the 3rd center of Near Eastern civilization. If you consider Mesopotamia and perhaps Egypt or the Levant as the other 2 centers, ancient South Arabia is really of that importance and quite diverse. Its history, like I said, stretches back to the late second millennium BCE until the rise of Islam. And of course, in the north, this image here, an image of Petra, is probably familiar to many. The north as well was filled with amazing kingdoms that also have very ancient histories, very diverse as well. This Petra was built by a group called the Nabateans, an Arabic-speaking group that inhabited the southern Levant and northern Arabia in the latter half of the 1st millennium BCE until about the 2nd century, 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century CE. Even in Central Arabia, this nice mural comes from a lost city that was discovered and excavated in the last century, Qaryat al-Faw, South Central Arabia, South Central Saudi Arabia. And you have these beautiful wall paintings giving us an idea of day-to-day life, of art, of language from these various places. Ancient Arabia was ironically, and if you think about this from, again, taking the popular view, the idea that the Arabians before Islam were illiterate, they did not, in general, employ writing. Actually, ancient Arabia was probably one of the most literate places in the ancient Near East. The inscriptions discovered so far exceed 100,000 specimens, and not in a single language, dozens of languages, dozens of scripts, some in languages rather close to Arabic as we know it, some in languages that are more distant from Arabic than Hebrew or Aramaic, and some still in scripts and languages that are undeciphered, that remain undeciphered. And this spans the entire peninsula. Here's a rough map of the kind of linguistic and epigraphic diversity that we can see in ancient Arabia. And so when I just give you this brief overview, it's very clear that it would be impossible for me to go through in detail all of this incredible diversity within the span of 45 minutes. So instead, we'll bypass the stories that are collected in the 9th century, the 10th century, and literary sources from the Islamic period, and go directly to what is perhaps the earliest witness of pre-Islamic Arabia and from the Islamic period, and that is the Quran. So here we have, for example, a fragment of what is probably the earliest dated Quran, dated to 635 AD, or at least that's the latest it could be, probably perhaps earlier. And the Quran as a text was compiled rather early, and the Quran has a lot to say about ancient Arabia. It mentions past civilizations, past groups in Arabia. It mentions religious rituals, gods, customs, and we can read now the Quran in light of archaeological discoveries, in light of epigraphic discoveries, and sort of complete the picture of the Quran's depiction of ancient Arabia, or even we can say the memory of ancient Arabia as presented in the Quran. I would like to begin by looking at lost groups. The Quran mentions several tribes, several groups that were destroyed by God as punishment for their disobedience, for their sin. And among these, in addition to, for example, groups that we might find in the Bible, like Pharaoh and his people, we find local Arabian tribes or peoples mentioned in the Quran. One of these major groups is called Ad, right? So you have, for example, in a few verses, have you not seen how your Lord has dealt with Ad, Iram of the pillars? And of course, they reject God and his messengers, and they are destroyed. Now, Ad has been a source of a lot of debate within classical exegetical material, and indeed among modern scholars. It wasn't uncommon a couple of decades ago to find the opinion that Ad was simply an invention of the Quran, that this was not a historical group. They are certainly not mentioned clearly in historical sources that we know of. But, and likewise, Iram was a source of a lot of confusion. Traditional, exegetes wondered whether Iram was a place, whether it was a people. There was, and if it was a place, where was it? Some have guessed Oman, Yemen, Syria, all over the place. So whatever the Quran was referring to here, it did not, the cultural memory that the audience of the Quran must have had did not make its way to the exegetes intact. But what we know is that Iram is present-day Wadi Ram in Jordan. And that is made clear by the fact that there are inscriptions at Wadi Ram in Jordan that call the place Iram. And all you have is a very small sound change where the beginning, the Hamza, has been lost. It's a very common sound change in Arabic. So Iram becomes Ram, and that's Wadi Ram that you find advertised as a tourist destination all over the place. That is indeed ancient Iram mentioned in the Quran. And here is a very nice inscription, the Jabal Ram inscription. It is in a predecessor of the Arabic script. And it's a small graffito by a man. His first name is lost, but he's the son of Ali or Aliyu. And he says that this is Kitab Yadih, the writing of his hand, bi Iram, at Iram. And Iram is indeed the place where this inscription was found. And there are many other inscriptions mentioning that the location that we call Wadi Ram today is indeed Iram. But what is more fascinating is a Ismaic inscription, an ancient Arabian inscription published in 1998 from a temple at the base, or the ruins of a temple at the base of Jabal Ram. And the inscription reads, by Ghawth, son of Allah, son of Thukam. And he constructed the temple of Allat belonging to the lineage of Ad. So you have here independent archaeological evidence of a connection between Ad and the place we call Iram, and that Ad is a historical group writing inscriptions apparently in this particular alphabet, We know this alphabet was used around the turn of our era, so about 2,000 years ago. They must have been a group in that period in this place. Indeed, here's another inscription in another alphabet, another related alphabet that comes from northeastern Jordan, Safietic, where it's simply a man who belongs to the tribe of Ad leaving his name. His name is Zuhay, son of Amir, of the lineage of Ad. Here's a photograph of the ruins of the temple of Allat that the tribe of Ad constructed at Iram. So the Quran putting these two groups together, these two things together, reflects a sort of knowledge that historically this toponym was associated with this people, and indeed that is what we find in the archaeological record. But rather than this group being part of the very, very distant past, it was a group that inhabited the region some centuries before the appearance of Islam, probably around 2,000 years ago. Another lost group is Thamud. Thamud is mentioned in the Quran along the same lines of Ad. Usually Ad is mentioned first and then Thamud. And the Thamud are the ones who carved into the stone valley, right? Into the stone in the valley, right? Into these, they would carve their houses into the rock face. And so Thamud is also associated with a group called Ashab al-Hijr, or the people of al-Hijr. And here you have the people of Hijr denied the missionaries and Mursaleen, and they used to carve dwellings out of the mountains feeling secure. And if you go to Al-Hijr today, you will find, it's an amazing archaeological site, these types of facades carved directly into the stone, right? Thamud, unlike Ad though, Thamud was known from other from other sources, literary sources, and historically, for example, the Assyrian king Sargon II claims to have defeated Thamud in distant Arabia. Okay, later Greek and Roman historians discuss Thamud and place them in northwest Arabia, where we think they are, and where indeed the Quran appears to place them. Thamud also leaves several inscriptions for us to read. At a temple north of Al-Hijr, a Nabatean inscription was commissioned by a group called the Thamud. Actually, they're called Sharikat Thamud, where Sharikat, Mike McDonald takes to understand that to refer to a Roman military unit. So here we find a Thamud serving the Romans, sort of under the employ of the Romans, right? Another Roman document from the 5th century, the Notitia Dignitatum, mentions Thamud as in two places as military units as well. Other inscriptions here, a Safiric inscription, in fact, is dated to an obscure event involving Thamud, clearly outside peoples. It's dated to an event called, which literally says the year, literally Sanata Haraba Gusham ala Thamud, the year the people, this group of people called Gusham, waged war against the Thamud. So they're attested independently in outside sources. They're attested in the Safietic source from northeastern Jordan discussing them, and indeed in this in a Greek inscription that they commissioned in northwestern Arabia. But perhaps one of the most interesting texts associated with the Thamud that we know about is this short graffito that comes from North Arabia in a script that, well, we call Thamudic C, or it's the script type is really unclear, and indeed the language is hard to understand. It's small and the photograph is incomplete, but it simply is an invocation to the god of Thamud, whoever that god might be, whatever his proper or her proper name is. Or his, I guess, because it would be Ilah. Ha Ilah Thamud. And then we have the following letters, Mim, Ha, Lam, Lam, Ha. We don't have enough information to sort of decipher the meaning of that. We could speculate on some things, but it is an invocation to this god of Thamud, a text probably composed by someone belonging to this group. All of this, again, it points towards the fact that Thamud was an active social group actually across centuries, from all the way the 8th century BCE until the 3rd or 4th century AD. But by the Quran's time, Thamud had disappeared, and Thamud belonged to the ancient past. Like Ad, these groups had disappeared, and the tales of them were being told as having suffered a destruction for their disbelief in God. But nevertheless, we find them in the archaeological record, and that's fantastic. Now, going back to these dwellings of Thamud, or these dwellings of Ashab al-Hijr, right? These facades are usually identified as as what the verse is referring to. But what's fascinating is that these facades here are accompanied by inscriptions. And inscriptions at the time of the Quran, it seems, and even later, were no longer legible. The alphabet, the script in which these inscriptions were carved had been lost, and so they could not be read. But the script is deciphered today, and it can be read. And indeed, now we know that these structures here were not homes, at least not terrestrial homes. This inscription on the right is associated with it comes from the site of Al-Hijr, and it is, let me see if I can bring this pointer here, laser pointer, excellent. This part of the inscription is in what we call the Nabatean script. It is the ancestor of the Arabic script. The Arabic script as we know it and use it today evolves directly from this script, this Nabatean script, which itself is a cursive form of Imperial Aramaic. And this script going down the side is a local Arabian alphabet, an indigenous Arabian alphabet. So we have two scripts here, but we'll read this part here that will tell us what these structures actually are. It begins with the demonstrative dana. Dana means this in Aramaic. The inscription is mixed language, Aramaic and Arabic. So it begins with dana, this, and then qabru, sana'ahu ka'bu bar, harithat, لرقوش برت عبد مانوتو أمه وهي هلكت في الحجر. So this is not the house, but qabr, the grave, which Ka'ab, son of Harithat, constructed for his mother, for Raqosh Bart Abd Manoto, his mother, and she died, she perished in Al-Hijr, right, or in Al-Hijr. Very nice. And it goes on to say, don't anyone remove a body from this or you'll be cursed. It's a legal text, basically marking property and rights to access this grave. So we know from the inscriptions at the site, indeed, that these structures, these facades were originally burials, graves. So quite fascinating indeed. Now, the Quran, in addition to mentioning ancient peoples such as these that we can locate archaeologically, also mentions two sets of pre-Islamic deities, okay? The first are mentioned in the context of the Noah tale, where Noah's people are telling him, or saying, do not abandon your gods, as he's basically preaching monotheism. Do not abandon, and 5 gods are mentioned: Wad, Suwa, Yahuth, Ya'uq, and Nasr, or Nisr, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Now, these gods that are mentioned here, remember in the story, in the context of the Quran, they are from the period before the flood. They belong to the very, very distant past. And 3 out of these 5 gods, but probably more, well, probably the others will appear too, it's just a matter of documentation, but 3 of these 5 gods do appear in the epigraphic record. But they appear, but their distribution and their chronology is quite remarkable. So we'll begin with the last, Nesr, or Neshra. This is the vulture or vulture god, and it's attested at Hatra, a settlement, a town in northern Iraq that is has an Arab, we can say an Arabic-speaking or culturally Arabian component, inhabited from the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. And there you find Neshra as a deity honored at that town. So, for example, you have a Hatran inscription that is written by someone or commissioned by Sanat Ruku, the righteous son of King Abdi Sinia. And he's built this for Nergal, the construction for Nergal, and for our Lord Neshra, for the victory of his father. So Neshra is mentioned here as a deity. The other deity, Yahuth, is mentioned quite far away in Central Arabia. So far only attested in graffiti, and especially in personal names. So the text that I have cited here is the person who wrote it is named Taym Yahuth, right? So the servant of Yahuth, theophoric name. And mentioned in Central Arabia. Wad, on the other hand, was the primary deity of one of the great South Arabian kingdoms, the Manaeans. He was their patron deity. Wad was actually a manifestation of the moon. And the inscription we have here, Wad is called Wad Shahran. And Shahran means the moon, right? So Wad the moon. The Manayans honored him in ancient South Arabia, and of course, wherever they went, his cult spread in their colonies. But the fascinating thing about Wad and all of these gods is that their worship seems to have ceased many centuries before the appearance of the Quran, which makes good sense when you think of their setting and the way they're mentioned in the Quran. They are put into what for the Quranic speakers would be the very, very distant past, right? And these indeed were rather ancient deities, even by the time that, even by the early Islamic or the eve of Islam. Now, of course, we know the most popular trio or trinity of gods in the Quran, goddesses, and they appear in Surah An-Najm 19 and 20, and they are part of the famous Satanic Verses episode, where the Quran is asking the audience, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى? Have you seen Allat and Al-Uzza and the other one, Manat or Manot? I put the reconstructed pronunciation. We can talk about those details in the question and answer if you like. Now, these three goddesses are mentioned in the Quran as being actively worshipped or somehow having a living cult at the time, right? And what is fascinating in a recent study by Layla Na'mi, who's a specialist of the epigraphy of the Nabatean epigraphy, and indeed is excavating at Madain Saleh Al-Hijr. She did a study on the divinities and the religion of the Hijaz, the northern Hijaz, based on the inscriptions. And indeed, as we move closer in time to the Quran, we see a narrowing of deities. There are fewer and fewer. And the last group of deities we can say that survive tend to be these three. So these would represent the very latest period, the very latest stage of divine figures in the epigraphic record. And indeed, we have, and that's how they appear in the Quran. Of course, they appear in the inscriptions in typical ways. You have mostly in Nabatean inscriptions in Northwest Arabia. For example, you might find a small graffiti. There's a small graffito that will ask the goddess Al-Uzza, for example, to give security to the author. I read to you, peace to Hani'at or Hani'at, slave of the goddess Al-Uzza, right? Manat also appears in prayers such as these. One inscription reads, remember, may Shalmu or Salmu, son of Salmu, be remembered for good forever before Dushara and Manat, right? So they form a little pair in this kind of context. But by far the most popular of these three in pre-Islamic Arabia would be Allat. I'm showing this is perhaps one of my favorite indications to Allat. This is a photo I took last year, 2019. So we skipped a year because of the virus. So 2019, at a cairn. What you're looking at here is a burial cairn, or a burial chamber, in fact, it's empty. It's a beautiful, you can see it's at a very high place, and you can see this wonderful landscape. And it seems that someone of some importance was buried here. You have lots of inscriptions, memorial inscriptions, funerary inscriptions in this location. And here, foreshadowing the custom of stopping and weeping at graves, we have one inscription by an individual. He mentions that he stopped and he remembered the dead, and he grieved. And then he makes this prayer to Allat, right? So, oh Allat, Allat, grant long life to your righteous worshiper. Ammiri sadiqik. But from death, there can be no deliverance. Wa min maut laysa fasai. So it's a beautiful prayer asking, invoking Allah to save his life, to lengthen his life, but ultimately death will reach everyone. Okay. So in the divine world that the Quran mentions, we do see, of course, the deities that are mentioned there, mostly attested in the epigraphic record, and perhaps even in the chronological way that they are presented in the Quranic text. There are, of course, so many more deities and so many rituals, and the fact that the Quran is mentioning these specific ones is significant, and we will come back to that at the end of the talk. The Quran also mentions various pre-Islamic religious rituals. It talks about, of course, pilgrimages is something that pre-exists. And indeed, pilgrimage is widely attested in Arabia, all over from South Arabia, from Yemen to Syria. The Arabians are embarking on pilgrimages. But from the epigraphic record, it is clear that there is no, how do we say it, pan-Arabian center of pilgrimage. There's no one place that all the Arabians are making pilgrimage to, as Mecca is presented in some traditional sources, but rather there are a lot of local pilgrimage sites dedicated to local gods that individuals will make their way to and make sacrifices at and offerings. So on the left, for example, we have a Safidic inscription from northern Jordan, where a man records that he ritually cleansed Rahaba during Virgo, during this time of year, Virgo, or could be a month name as well, the month of Virgo, in order to go on the pilgrimage. So there is this ritual of cleansing oneself, and we don't know exactly what that is, if it's washing, shaving, or whatever, but he's cleansing himself in order to perform this pilgrimage. On the right, we have a Dadanitic inscription over here that comes from the oasis of Dadan, which is modern day Al-Ula in northwestern Saudi Arabia, northern Hijaz. And here you see a group making a pilgrimage, right? Shi'at Nisa. They're making a pilgrimage for this god called Dhu Ghaybat, or what seems to be the master of the unseen. He is a god, the local god of the town of Dadan, and they're performing a pilgrimage, Haggagu or Haggaga li Dhu Ghabat biha masad, in the sanctuary. So in his sanctuary there. And at this site, in fact, there is a ton of inscriptions that attest pilgrimages and the performance of various rituals at this site to honor the god, the offering of material goods, or making or performing rituals on behalf of one's material possessions, one's crops, one's and other such things. And so pre-Islamic pilgrimage is quite widely attested. Some of the rituals are very familiar, but how do we say it? There is an absence of a single pan-Arabian center of pilgrimage. Other religious rituals mentioned in the Quran, mostly, of course, I would say either condemned or reinterpreted and continued later on, are attested. Of these is the custom of erecting the cult stone, or the altar, which is the nasab, and the animal sacrifice, the dhabah, right? So and both of these inscriptions come from Jordan, one from northeastern Jordan, one from southern Jordan. Here on the right, we have a very nice text where a man records entering into a ritually pure state, tahara, and then he made an animal sacrifice, dhabaha, to the god Rufai. That's a deity not mentioned in the Quran, but some memory of this deity continues into other sources. And then he does this with hopes of being rewarded with a she-camel, whether on a raid or we don't know how exactly that she-camel will come to him, but there's the purpose of it. This other text on the right was published in 2011, a lovely description of the performance of religious rituals and the purpose for that. This individual here, Uqaydat, son of Hayyan, of the lineage of Kumay, he erected a cult stone, Nasab, and made an animal sacrifice, Zabah, and he did this. He camped halal, kept watch for his companions who were on a raid. So Allat and Dusaras, he asked for security and a reunion with his companions, and he asked further for relief and spoil, presumably from the raid. So we have here very clearly the performance of these rituals with hopes of some material gain. And when do you do them? You do them before you are engaging in activities of uncertainty, right? Both of these texts probably date to about 2,000 years ago, these alphabets here, in different alphabets, but they record languages that are very, very close to Arabic as we know it. Other rituals, for example, like child sacrifice, are attested. And this brings to mind, for example, ayahs 9 through 10 in Takwir, right? إِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. When the maw'uda, which is understood to be the killed the female child who's killed, buried, or is asked for what sin was she killed. Now, these child sacrifice, or simply maybe just the killing of children, sacrifice is an interpretation here, is something attested in pre-Islamic Arabia. And indeed, prohibitions on it are already attested. So for example, in ancient South Arabia, this text here on the left was published in 2014. It's a stick. These are these sticks, these day-to-day documents that we talked about, and it records, it's in the Mannaic language. It records a prohibition on the killing of children. But here, whether male or female, anyone who kills their children, admits to it and does not stop, they will know the wrath of Astar. Astar is a local deity, a manifestation or perhaps a representation of Venus, a very powerful deity revered across ancient South Arabia. Astar, of course, is cognate with Ishtar, as we know from Babylonian sources. So here we have a prohibition. In ancient, and on the other side of the peninsula, in Tayma, northern Saudi Arabia, another text attesting to the killing of a youth. Now, the context is unclear. The man simply records that he killed Haraga, the youth. Could be an act of sacrifice, or it could simply be a record of something akin to the Ma'uda. But nevertheless, the killing of children, the killing of young, is something that we do find in the epigraphic record. Themes, different religious rituals that are also recorded in the Quran, and themes related to those are attested in the pre-Islamic inscriptions. This text here on the left, KRS 818, is fascinating. It records a man who climbs up to a high place, which is called samad. Okay, we know this word is a hapax in the Quran, but tested here multiple times in Safiyedic, referring to a high place in the landscape or a large rock. And what does he do? He sacrificed a camel upon it. ذَبَحَ جَمَلَ عَلَيْهِ. And then he calls out to his god, Yaytha. It's the name of a god. In fact, the name translates. It's a verb. It means he saves, savior. Yaytha, protect him from the enemy. The enemy is called the Shadid. So you have he sacrifices, he prays to his Lord for protection from the enemy. Something, the entire text is in its themes and its content quite comparable to Quran 108. This text here is a lovely one, discovered completely by accident. It was 2017. We were surveying in northern Jordan. You can see on the picture here on the left. I put my foot down, and it was a sandy hill, and the sand had covered an ancient cairn and many stones that were laying about. And as I put my foot down, I realized it was something hard. I started to dig, and it was, of course, a very interesting stone. I extracted it, and I have a drawing of it here. The text will be published soon. And the text is quite fascinating, very long text. In it, the author, it's a religious text. He says that he pastured during the heliacal rising of the 7 stars, Sab'ata Agum, which is the Pleiades, on herbage following the seasons of abundance. And he suffered misfortune and suspected the evil eye, which is called Naga'at or Naga'at. Okay? As he saw its evil, وَرَأَيَ شَرَّ مِنْهُ, he saw its evil and he despaired. And he invokes Allat, who is from, and the word Ain Mim Nun, could be Amman, Oman, we don't know, but she is from, Allat is from this place. The first time we know where this deity's mythological residence is. And Dushara, who is from Raqim or Raqmu, and this is Petra, ancient Petra, and that's not a surprise. We know that Dushara is the national god of the Nabateans, and that was their capital. But notice the name here, Raqim. Raqam is a name for Petra. That is the name used for Petra by the Nabateans and in ancient sources altogether. And we can come back to that later because we also get this word in the Quran. Grant abundance that he may be secure from misfortune. Salam min bu's. So we have here again, a very, very nice text that is reminiscent, that has all the themes that we see in the Quran, right? Here he's seeking protection from the shar, right? From evil eyes, from envy, from the hasad. And he ultimately wants security from bu's. All this is vocabulary that's used in later Arabic liturgical language a lot, and it shows and it speaks to a kind of ritualistic continuity from these earlier periods up into Quranic times. Now, what this text here, again, unfortunately undated, but these types of texts date roughly in the neighborhood of 2,000 years ago, not much later, okay? Excellent. So the Quran, of course, does mention pagans a few in several places, but it doesn't really describe in too much detail their rituals and their religious behaviors. It instead focuses more on the monotheistic groups that are around. Judaism, for example, is mentioned quite a bit in the Quran, and later and other historical and literary sources speak of Jewish tribes throughout Arabia. We know that in ancient South Arabia, the Himyarites had converted to Judaism or to a kind of a Jewish-inspired monotheism. And indeed, Jewish inscriptions abound in ancient Arabia, in the north and in the south. So you have here a few examples. One of the new discoveries and nice examples is this text here on the left that was discovered by some amateur explorers who have this website of sahra.org and edited by Leila Na'mi in 2018. The text is in Aramaic, but with some Arabic loan words. You have the translation over here. It's May Sulay, son of Aus. This is the individual be remembered well and be secure before the Lord of the world. Maray Alma. This would translate into Arabic as Rabb al-Alameen. And he wrote this text on Passover, the year 197. That comes out to be 303 AD. Okay, so it's a text that was dated to the day of Passover, no doubt written by a Jewish Arabian. And here we have text, of course, in Hebrew and Aramaic in the square letters, Hebrew script here very clearly, attesting to the presence of Jewish groups throughout North Arabia. And of course, in South Arabia, it's rather clear Judaism played a pretty big role. A very famous inscription here. May bless and be blessed the name of Rahmanan. Baraka wa tabaraka sim Rahmanan in the Sabbaic, right? Who is in heaven, and Israel and their God, Lord of the Jews, who assisted his servant. And you have the bits here, which is quite nice. Now, it goes on to mention different individuals who dedicated this text. Now, what's fascinating here is the use of this term right here, Rahmanan. This final an is in the Sabbaic language equivalent to the al in Arabic. And indeed, in South Arabia in the 4th century, the old pagan cults gave way to monotheism. The ancient kingdoms of South Arabia became monotheists. The ancient groups, the Himyar, became monotheists. Some say they converted directly to Judaism, or that they adopted a monotheism inspired by Judaism. But the name of the primary deity, the monotheistic deity in this period, was called Rahman. That was his epithet, the merciful. Right? This is an epithet that you can find used widely among Jews in the Near East. And so here we have Rahman as a name of the monotheistic deity. Christianity, of course, also appears in South Arabia. Most famously, Najran is a center of Christianity and is known from outside sources as well, Syriac sources, for example, where the Arabic tradition remembers Najran as a center of Christianity. But perhaps the biggest symbol of Christianity and when it has institutional power is the appearance of Abraha, the Ethiopian king, who Islamic tradition remembers as attempting to destroy Mecca. Well, he does appear in the inscriptions. This obelisk was commissioned by Abraha with the power, khayl, the aid, rada, the mercy, rahmat of Rahmanan, of the monotheistic deity. Again, here referring to the Father in the Christian Trinity, of his Messiah, Masihu, and of the Holy Spirit, Ruh Qudus. I, Abraha, have written this inscription. He describes himself as Azaleh. It's a title that we can't translate. The Ethiopian king, a few other titles that we can't translate. King of Saba, Dhuraidan, Hadramut, Yamanat, and their A'rab in Tawdim and Tihamat. Tawd is thought to be the Najd, and Tihamat, the Hijaz. So here's a beautiful example of the presence and the power of Christianity in the middle of the 6th century CE. So this is or 6th century AD. This is the middle of the 6th century AD, a Christian text set up by Abraha. And indeed, in the same period, we see Christianity, or perhaps Arabian monotheism, spreading throughout Arabia. So all of the texts, all these pagan texts that we have gone over, These date to around 2,000 years ago, around the turn of our era, maybe up to the 4th century. But so far, there aren't very clear examples of traditional Arabian paganism continuing past the 4th century in the epigraphic record. Rather, the Arabic inscriptions, and by the 6th century, the Arabic script as we know it had fully emerged. And the inscriptions that survive, that make use of the script, are interestingly either all Christian or somehow monotheistic. So here's a nice spread of various inscriptions. The earliest one is this one, dated to 470 CE, that comes from Bir Hima, north of Najran. You see the very big cross here. It's by a man named Thawban Maliku. And he dates his text to the month of Burak. He uses Aramaic still, Biyarah Burak, Sanat, and then he gives you the date, okay? Text from Dumat al-Jandal, Arabic script as well. Dhakara al-Ilah, may the God, al-Ilah, the God. This seems to be an Arabic calque of Khotheo, so Allah. May the God be mindful of, right? And the person's name here seems to be Janu or something of this sort. And there is a cross. You can see that there is a cross right here as well. Very standard Christian formula. This is a Christian text, well known. This one has been published. The Harran inscription has been known for many, many, many decades. But more and more Arabic texts from the 6th century, which we can tell paleographically in terms of their content, continue to be discovered. In fact, it's a waterfall of text. So in former times, one might say that we only had 3 or 4 Arabic inscriptions from the 6th century. The corpus was very small. Now there's quite a few. Hard to say exactly because most of these texts are published informally on the internet by their discoverers, but nevertheless, many new texts to discuss, and they continue to give us the same story. This is a text by someone called Qais, son of Ahmad. Qais bar Ahmad, Katib li Bani al-Khazraj. He is a scribe of the Bani al-Khazraj. We know Bani al-Khazraj as one of the tribes of pre-Islamic Yathrib and of Medina, right? And he gives you this greeting, Silmun antum, may you be a priest, and I urge you to be devoted to God. فَلَا أُوصِيكُمْ بِبِرْءِ الْإِلَهِ وَاللَّيْلِ وَالْقُوَّةِ, and the night and the power. I have no interpretation of what those two words mean. Of course, the night of power is something we know from the Quran, but I don't know what they mean in this context, right? Here's another text, and you can see here that there might have been originally a small cross that has been hammered out, and this is not too uncommon. Passerbys will often hammer out crosses as an act of piety. In fact, this even affects crosses that aren't Christian. For example, in some of these ancient Arabian alphabets, the T is a cross, and pious folk later on will hammer out the T's of these inscriptions when they are in fact pagan inscriptions having nothing to do with Christianity, mistaking those T's for the cross. So that might be here an expression of religious affiliation, but it's very clear that the text is monotheistic. Likewise, this is a new text that was published just a couple of months ago online by this individual mentioned here in a video. This is a screenshot of the video. A beautiful text. I am Thabit, Ana Thabit. He's of the Bani Khazraj, and it's the same type of inscription. May you be secure, Silmun Amtum. And so I urge you to be devoted to God, to feed the guest, to fight the enemy, to fight the enemy, to carry out raids and to be brave, or to rescue and help people. And may your Lord preserve you, for Allah is the best of this, or the best at doing this, the preservers. وَحَيَّاكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ. Very, very interesting. This is, in all ways, a pre-Islamic text, paleographically in terms of its context, of its orthography. All of these point to a 6th century date for the text, but you see that the language is monotheistic, the vocabulary, the ways of expression is all very reminiscent of what would become Muslim phraseology and what we find in later Islamic texts. But perhaps the icing on the cake of this emergent monotheism, or this widespread monotheism in the 6th century, is this fascinating inscription that was published in 2018 by Al-Hajj and Faqas. It is a text in the ancient South Arabian script. This comes from the other side of the peninsula. The texts we looked at previously come from the northern Hijaz, between Al-Ula and Tabuk. This text comes from Yemen, but its language is still Arabic, although the script is ancient South Arabian, and it begins like this. Bismillah ar-Rahman, irhamna Rabb al-Samawat, irzuqna min fadlika, wa athrina mukhahu shakimat ayyamina. So in the name of Allah, ar-Rahman, the Rahman. Notice the third part of the Basmala is not present yet. It's not ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, but simply Allah ar-Rahman. Have mercy upon us, O Lord of the heavens. Irhamna, right? Irzuqna min fadlika. Satisfy us by means of your favor. These exact phrases are attested in later prayers and whatnot from the Islamic period. And grant us the essence of it, or enrich us with the essence of it, the gift of our life. Okay, so you can find various similarities of this kinds of prayers in the Psalms, very reminiscent of Psalm. But what's very clear is that this is a pre-Islamic text that has that's from the same pool of material, you can say, that later form Islamic expressions and whatnot. And this is also the paleographically, that is by the letter shapes, this text, it must be 6th century, maybe even early 7th century, but very unlikely to be Islamic as such because of the divergent phraseology. It'd be very strange to find the Basmala without the second component of the third component of the Rahim, for example. And other issues of it, of course, suggest very strongly a 6th or perhaps early 7th century date. So let us then kind of come back to this issue of the Quran and pre-Islamic Arabia. If we look at pre-Islamic Arabia through the lens of the Quran, we actually end up getting a very logical chronology and picture of and the evidence fit with the text quite well. The Quran references historical peoples and deities, but it is focused on the former Nabatean realm. And this is the area here on this map. This is mostly the area of the historical peoples and the groups that it's talking about. That's where they come from. We mentioned Ad and Thamud, which both come from this area. The gods, Allat, Al-Uzza, Manat, are also Nabatean gods that are coming from this area. Al-Raqim, which we mentioned, Petra, we know that this is attested in Surah Al-Kahf, for example. There was a lot of disagreement by the commentators as to what this toponym or what this term actually refers to, but it's very clearly, and this is an argument made cogently by Meisha Dell in a recent article, that it is very clearly the ancient name of Petra, also pointing forward. And you can go on. And overall, you see for the Quran, its ancient past, when it refers to the distant past, to its ancient Arabia, seems to be the Nabatean realm. And this fits very well because the script and the language, the script that the Quran is put down in, the Arabic script that was employed in these areas, ultimately descends linearly from the Nabatean script. In other words, it is simply a later changed form of Nabatean, right? That we call the Arabic script at this certain point in history. And the Arabic language, of course, is a northern language rather than a southern one. It's very different from the ancient languages of Yemen. So that comes all together, that the Quran is thinking of its past as one connected to the Nabatean realm. But what's also interesting is how concerned and how much the Quran gives, how clear a picture the Quran gives us of monotheism in Arabia, as if the audience that it's addressing is primarily monotheistic or overwhelming monotheistic. And this does fit the epigraphic record. As I've showed you, almost all the texts that we have from the 6th century so far are monotheistic. We don't have, now that doesn't mean that there weren't pagans, not at all. But what it does mean is that paganism had receded, and that Christianity, Judaism, and perhaps local Arabian monotheistic offshoots of these traditions were much more widespread than we have traditionally thought. And the Quran's concern with them reflects their reflects the what we find in the epigraphic record, indeed. The final point is that the cultural knowledge that the Quran has about pre-Islamic Arabia also fits the epigraphic record, fits the archaeological record much better than later attempts by historians and exegetes to understand those references. So it would seem that the Quran and its audience had some cultural knowledge of their ancient past that did not survive the huge changes that accompanied the Arab conquests. And so that cultural knowledge, which of course didn't have very much theological importance, it didn't matter theologically if Ad was in Yemen or in Jordan, the story is what counted. That kind of knowledge disappeared. And so later on, exegetes were sort of at didn't have anything to work with to figure out who these groups were, where they were, and at what times and what periods in time they existed. The Quran seems to have had and inherited some cultural knowledge of that. Okay, so thank you. And I'll end here. Of course, there's so much more to talk about almost on every slide, but I'll end here. I thank you again very much for your attention and the invitation. I hope we can have a good discussion. If you want to contact me, you have my email here to continue the discussion. And also this website here will provide you a link to most of my published papers, which go into detail on a lot of these different subjects. Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Al-Jallad, for a very rich and interesting presentation. Now we will open the floor for Q&A. If you'd like to type in your question, you can just, if you're on a laptop, you'll notice the toolbar at the bottom, the Q&A there. If you're on a cell phone or a smartphone, you may need to swipe or look around a little bit to find it. I will begin actually with one question, and that is, you mentioned 100,000 inscriptions. And what I wonder is, how much of that do we have at the Hijaz region, this in Central Arabia?
Yes, so of course, the Hijaz is quite large. There are, the inscriptions I was referring to specifically are pre-Islamic inscriptions. The number rises, I think, maybe could even double if you consider inscriptions from the Islamic period. But in the Hijaz region, so all the inscriptions that I've showed you here are from the Hijaz, the Arabic ones, right, that I've read. They come from north of Medina, basically the northern part of the Hijaz between Medina and Tabuk. Now, the areas around Mecca, for example, haven't been extensively surveyed. Actually, none of these areas have been extensively surveyed. It's huge. People often forget that the Arabian Peninsula is basically a continent. It's massive, and it's going to take a long time to kind of go through everything. But there are a number of inscriptions. Actually, most of our 6th century Arabic inscriptions today are coming from the area of the Hijaz. We await proper surveys around the area of Mecca, for example, or south. Those areas haven't been properly investigated. But there's also, in addition to Arabic script, there are a lot of more ancient texts. So there are a lot of pre-Arabic inscriptions that come from these areas, even from the areas of Mecca, that attest what was there before the spread of Arabic, for example. And so you have, for example, and you have, of course, mentions of these places. There's a Nabatean inscription that probably could date very nicely between the 2nd century AD to maybe from in the classical Nabatean period. So maybe the first 2 centuries AD. And it's by a man who just says that he is from Min Yathrib. He comes from Yathrib, but he's using Nabatean and everything. So it suggests that this is that the Nabatean script and that tradition was already in place in Yathrib at the turn of the era, right? Which is quite fascinating. So yes, the corpus is growing quite a bit.
Fascinating, thank you.
Yeah.
So here's a question. I'm curious about the carved sticks with writing on them. How large are they? Do many survive? And they wanted to clarify, these are found in Southern Arabia?
Yes. So these carved sticks, a bark that come from palm. This was basically what Southern Arabian civilizations in South Arabia and perhaps elsewhere, it's a matter of survival, used to carve their day-to-day documents, letters and so forth. The published corpus is quite large. Most of the texts that are known to us and that have been studied in a scientific way are present in collections in Europe and Leiden in Germany. And these texts were purchased in Yemen, okay, and brought from Yemen. There should be around, and the good estimate, around 10,000 texts of this sort exist, and the vast majority have not been studied. But these texts record, as you see, a prohibition on killing your children. They have, there's a few texts actually that record religious literature, incantations, lots of letters, contracts, receipts, basically gives you an image of day-to-day life. The texts that have been dated, carbon dated, have come from the Leiden collection, right? So they've been taken, that's how we have a basic rough chronology of those. There are two languages expressed in these texts. The first is Sabaic, which is the most widely attested language of ancient South Arabia. And the second is Minaic, which is the language of the Minaian kingdom. Those are the two most common found in these texts. And it's possible that they were used elsewhere, but that's what survives in South Arabia. Yeah.
I do want to actually ask you this follow-up question about the wood. How has the wood with text written on it lasted this long?
Yes, so the nice thing about the texts that are written, it's not written with ink, it's carved into the wet wood so that when it dries, it's preserved. And it lasts because it's a very arid environment, the same way, for example, papyri lasts in Egypt because it's very arid. The arid environment helps preserve these types of things, so it lasts. I've held these texts in my hand. They're very sturdy. It's incredible. You can hold a text 2,500-year-old piece of wood, and it's you could do some damage with it. It's quite strong. Yeah.
Very good. This reads, that was fresh and very good in terms of breadth covered. I would be interested if there are any Dravidian languages lurking behind some of the yet to be translated inscriptions.
I don't. There's nothing to suggest so. Even the undeciphered inscriptions still seem to be Semitic languages. They have characteristics of Semitic morphology. They use words like bin, which is the common Semitic word for sun. So they do seem to be Semitic. They're just not any Semitic language that we know. And therefore, it's very hard to make sense of them. And it's also the nature of some of these inscriptions. When you have small corpora of texts that are quite short, it's very difficult to make sense sometimes of what things, even if you come up with an interpretation, how do you know what's correct if you only have a single representation? Yeah.
This next, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
This next question, oh, you're fine.
Yeah.
This next question is requesting clarification. Did I hear correctly that after the 4th century, paganism or polytheism is not attested in the epigraphic record, but rather mostly Christianity or other monotheistic inscriptions? Did Dr. Al-Jallad mean this for one region or regions of Arabia or all over?
So in the 4th century, so in South Arabia, you have this shift to monotheism. The old cults are abandoned, and you have this new state-sponsored monotheism where you have devotion to the single deity Rahmanan. It seems to be Jewish-inspired. It's indeed. Later Arabic tradition recalls Himyar as having converted to Judaism, in fact. Okay. Now, this is the people who commission inscriptions. They're all going to be, the state and powerful individuals are going to commission inscriptions. Now, we can't know whether in some mountain in Yemen, people were still worshiping the old gods. They could be, but they're not going to show up in the epigraphic record. Likewise, when we look throughout Arabia, we see this trend. There's something very interesting. So all of the Arabic inscriptions that we have so far from after this period are either secular, there's no religious information in them, or they're monotheistic. So we don't, and that sharply contrasts with just a few centuries earlier, where you have all of these pagan inscriptions, which I've been sharing, right? So it's not that the pagans weren't writing. In fact, they were writing. They used to write many, many inscriptions, but somehow that just teeters off, that disappears. We don't know why. And then monotheistic inscriptions appear. So the most natural explanation is that monotheism, as it did almost everywhere in the Mediterranean, this place in the 4th century, started to spread and push out traditional Arabian religion, so that if traditional Arabian religion survived, it did so in very remote places and in pockets. It wasn't something that was practiced by all the Arabians in this period, right? So it's possible that, as I'm saying this, somebody's discovered a 6th century text that invokes Allat, and that wouldn't be surprising. But the surprising thing, though, is and maybe it isn't surprising once we look at the Quran, of course, but how widespread monotheism is, right? How widespread monotheism is.
Hmm. I wonder, is it possible to catch fake inscriptions?
Yeah, I think it's very, very easy. So for example, on basalt, if you carve an inscription now, it will be a very different color than an inscription that's been sitting there for 2,000 years. You wouldn't be able to fake an inscription on basalt. Otherwise, and other ways you can detect from letter forms and all this kind of stuff. But you have to think also in two other ways. People usually fake inscriptions to either do sensational, to have some kind of sensational purpose, or to sell. Now, you can't sell an inscription that's on a mountain face, and all of the inscriptions that we find are actually rather boring. They're not giving us any real heavy information, so it's very unlikely they're fake. There are fake sticks, though. There are fake sticks, and the way we know that they're fake sticks is because when individuals fake the sticks, they usually they have so far copied inscriptions we already know. So we say, oh, this inscription was published there. This is clearly a fake. Because there are blank sticks, not all these sticks were inscribed, and the ones that were blank survived, right? So they survived as well. And also, when you carve on a stick that's been sitting around, it looks different as well. And so it is, the interest in faking Arabian inscriptions, thankfully, has not reached the interest in faking inscription, for example, biblical inscriptions. And so we don't need science. You could still even detect fakes there. But that hasn't yet reached the case. And luckily, since so many of these texts are carved on basalt, basalt provides a natural fake, what do you call it? Turnitin module. Yeah.
Right. Very interesting. This next question from Salman. Is there any poetry that is similar to pre-Islamic poetry mentioned in later sources in the inscriptions?
The qasida, the pre-Islamic ode in that form, has not appeared in the inscriptions as such in Arabic, but in the non-Arabic languages of Yemen, there are several longer rhymed compositions that are not easy to understand and that have not really been deciphered completely, but they're very clearly rhymed, and they seem to be metrical because the lines are more or less the same length. So it looks like that format was present in pre-Islamic South Arabia, although the language was in Arabic. Okay, and there are a few examples of these. Now, the trouble with poetry, as we know from the pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, is that it's an oral art. And so it's not very likely that you're going to actually put that in writing. There is a inscription, some religious, we can say it's not poetry by the classical Arabic definition, but it is poetic language, it is rhymed. There is a text from, there's a Nabatean text, probably before 150 CE. It is a dedication to a deity called the Ubudat, or Ubudat, it's a deified Nabatean king. And there's a small hymn that is composed in this text for him or associated with him, maybe part of his liturgy. And it reads, فَيَفْعَلْ لَا فِدَ وَلَا أَثَرَ فَكُنْ هُنَا يَبْغِنَا الْمَوْتُ لَا أَبْغَاهُ فَكُنْ هُنَا أَرَادَ جُرْحُ لَا يُرِدْنَا. So we have here 3 short lines. We have an end rhyme, right? He works, فَيَفْعَلْ لَا فِدَ وَلَا أَثَرَ. He works, so there should be no ransom nor scar. فَكُنْ هُنَا يَبْغِنَا الْمَوْتُ. So if death should seek us here, لَا أَبْغَاهُ, he would not allow it to obtain. فَكُنْ هُنَا أَرَادَ جُرْحُ. And if a wound sought a victim, wants a victim, لَا يُرِدْنَا. Let it not want us. Let it not take us, right? It's just a small, it's just like an incantation or something. It's just a protective prayer, right? Associated with this deity. So here you have the rhyme and the construction. So that does not look like the qasida, but in terms of its stylistics, it looks like the short surahs of the Quran, right? Like where you have the incantation, right? So you're asking for the same thing, same type of structure. So it falls more into that genre of literature rather than the qasida. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hafsa from Manchester in the UK is asking if it is true that textual inscriptions were more prevalent in Arabia than graphic figurative ones.
It's so fantastic. Great question. What's wonderful and what's kind of sad at the same time is that you see all of these pagan inscriptions that we have, these traditional Arabian inscriptions, but we don't have we don't have any evidence that they would actually depict their gods anthropomorphically. So we don't have images of their gods. In fact, their gods seem to have been understood more as forces like nature and emotions. Rudal, one famous god, is simply satisfaction, right? Wad is called Shahran, the moon. It's not the god of the moon, an anthropomorphic figure who controls the moon. It just seems to be the moon. So we don't have in among the nomads, I'll say more specifically, later on the Nabateans adopt Hellenistic styles and start to depict their gods as Hellenistic gods. But the nomads or the traditional Arabian religion did not depict its gods anthropomorphically. But we do have lots of visual art, huge depictions of camels, wildlife, gazelles, hunts, war scenes, all kinds of depictions of this sort. So rock art is very, very common. It's just not depicting the divine world, right? And you have these idealistic depictions of herds of animal, gazelles, oryxes being hunted, camels, horsemen. Beautiful rock art. In fact, on the flyer here, you have a few examples of that rock art. You have a party scene where there seem to be some men performing a debka and someone playing a mijwaz, right? It's a beautiful, it seems 2,000 years old, but it's something that seems very familiar indeed.
Very interesting. Professor Salah Hassan writes, fascinating research, impressive scholarship. Thank you for sharing. My question is, do you have any opinion on Salibi's book, The Bible Came from Arabia? Your research seems to support some aspects of his claims.
I don't, if you think about the chronology, it doesn't really work out. So when I'm talking about Jews in Arabia and this is coming from, around 2,000 years ago. So this is very late considering biblical chronology. So I would say that I think most specialists don't buy that idea that the Bible comes from Arabia, but rather, I think we stand a lot to learn by looking at Arabian inscriptions as part of the same world that is described in the Bible. So many of the tribes, the Arabian tribes described in the Bible that we find in Arabian lineages are attested as tribes in Arabia, right? The place names, the peoples, there is the same way that we can look at this material through the lens of the Quran, we can also look at it through the lens of the Hebrew Bible, and we'll see that indeed that this material belongs also to that world. And as for example, there is a theory that, for example, the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, is an Arabian God or an Edomite God who comes from the south. That, for example, has not been confirmed by the epigraphy. There's no evidence that the Arabians worshipped Yahweh, in at least as far as we can see in the epigraphy. We have a good view of the various deities all across Arabia, and that's not one. So that's one hypothesis. It's a bit challenged by the epigraphy, indeed.
Interesting. Professor Brahim Shakrani writes, thank you for this great talk. Right before Islam, there were some Unitarians along with Christianity and Judaism. I wonder if you might comment on this.
Yes, so we're talking about the Hanifs, right? And it is possible, so it is possible that what Islamic tradition is referring to as Hanifs are these Arabian monotheists that we see in these inscriptions. For example, this where we see the phraseology, if I may, can you still see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. Yes, okay, so we can go back. So for example, this individual here, Thabit of the Khazraj, who urges people to be devoted to God. You have these It'am al-Dayf, Qital al-Adu, Haml al-Ghazaw, Najd, or however these are vocalized, we don't know, because obviously there's no vowels, and we don't know the exact dialect being used here. وَحَيَّاكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ ذَا. This individual doesn't necessarily have to be a Christian or a Jew. This could be an Arabian monotheist and of course later tradition would view such or call such an individual a Hanif. That's possible, right? We don't know. Unfortunately, he doesn't tell us what he calls himself. It's not necessary, obviously. People know. But he is giving, a list of values that the society would find that to be important. And this is a type of text that exists. What is fascinating, though, and I think that this is what's very nice, is that these seem to be so far the only kinds of texts that we find. We don't have the text written by someone who says "Uzikum bi-birr al-Uzza" or "Bibil al-Lat" or whatever, right? Or worship Allat al-Uzza. Those don't exist. In sharp contrast, in sharp contrast to just a few centuries earlier, where they can't stop mentioning them in the inscriptions, right? So it's that contrast, if you look at it on a timeline, that really gives you the feeling that something big has happened in Arabia before Islam, and that the tide had already turned towards monotheism, right? Islam may be and that's why, for example, if you look at the Quran, it spends a lot of time engaging with monotheistic traditions. If the Quran reflects its landscape, then monotheism has a huge role. Monotheistic traditions like Christianity and Judaism are very well present in the audience. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. This next question, why did people stop writing in Safavidic? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, correct.
And what happened to the writers of Safavidic inscriptions?
Well, we don't know why they stopped writing. I've articulated this hypothesis in several talks, and I should probably find the time to sit down and write it out fully. But if you think about these inscriptions here, like this one, a lot of the Safavidic, the vast majority of texts are just names, and we put those aside, but the texts that have content, there's a very strong religious theme in these texts. These inscriptions are very they're used to invoke the gods. They often describe bad circumstances, or they describe the performances of rituals for the ancient gods. They honor the gods. They seem to be part of the religious rituals that these individuals used to perform. So in the north, and we can be sure that in the 4th century, for example, the spread of Christianity into the deserts of North Arabia was happening. I mean, there are a lot of accounts in literary sources of missionaries, holy men going out to preach Christianity to the heathen Saracens, as they were called, and these mass conversions, and whatever mass conversion meant. Maybe they didn't know what exactly, I mean, they were converting, but it doesn't come with, let's say, any kind of theological sophistication, but they would know to do certain things, not to do certain things, like don't sacrifice animals to this god anymore. And if these inscriptions are associated with that, then that kind of cultural shift would very naturally lead to the extinction of this writing system. There's a parallel, for example, if you think of the fate of hieroglyphics in Egypt. It was the conversion to Christianity, and that motivated the shift of the Egyptians to use the Greek script away from what is literally called away from a script that was so closely related to their ancient religion. Okay, and it's not uncommon to see that script often follows religion. You just look at who uses the Arabic script versus who uses the Cyrillic script and the Roman script. So you get the idea. So that might explain. I mean, this is a hypothesis. It's impossible to prove. I'm giving a talk on the 16th of a new inscription, a new discovery that I'll give the talk introducing it. I'll publish it later this year. And it is the first Safavidic inscription that has a prayer to a character, someone, to a deity. And obviously it's a deity, but it's when I tell you the name, you'll be like, what? And I hope you will attend the talk. The name is Isa. So yeah, it's an invocation to Isa. So okay, maybe this is Jesus, and maybe this reflects this transition to Christianity. Well, we'll see. You'll have to come to the talk.
Interesting. Well, I should mention that your Twitter handle is Safavidic.
Yeah.
So if anyone, maybe maybe if you want to go on his Twitter page, you'll see the more information.
Yes,
about
I should do that. I haven't done much on Twitter recently, but I should get back.
Right, you mentioned the social media.
Yes, right? I was fasting. Yeah.
Yes. This next question comes from Alia. Thank you for this fascinating talk. What's your perception of how widespread literacy was in pre-Islamic Southern Arabia, especially in the monotheistic period just before Islam? It seems like the existence of these texts in so many languages suggests a high level of regional education and literacy.
I think we have to think in literacy. We think about literacy as a spectrum. So there are a lot of people who probably knew the alphabet and could probably write their names, and that's why we have thousands and thousands of graffiti, individuals writing their names. So they know that. But how many people could read long literary texts? I would say there were probably fewer doing that. I don't think we have enough evidence to make very precise claims about literacy in this specific period. But what I would say in general about, if to make a generalization, well, in South Arabia, you did have a scribal class. You had scribal education. This was, this is very clear by the fact that for 1,500 years, the Sabaic language changes in very, very small ways. And this is not something you expect with natural language. This suggests a literary register that is being preserved by an institution, right? That is being used across centuries. The texts are composed in very formulaic ways and what have you. So it suggests that there is a scribal class. And indeed, the letters that we have do give evidence of this. They'll say, for example, this is read to so-and-so this, or this was commissioned by so-and-so to be written, right? So it's not that individuals are writing their own texts. So I think that there is a scribal class, and that reading and writing was probably required in education, especially since the literary language was probably different than the day-to-day speech that people were conversing in, and depending on the area. But I would say that probably a lot of people, a lot more than we think, had basic literacy, knew the alphabet, and could make their way through public texts and identify words and what have you. Yeah.
Fascinating. I wonder, do you ever see attempts to scratch out inscriptions?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I have a beautiful example in the Safietic dictionary. There is so the inscriptions many of the inscriptions go through great lengths. They come up with elaborate curses so that you don't destroy the inscription. And they ask people to read them and honor them, right? And so you have curses like, and they can be very short or very long, and some are, all kinds of diseases. You may lose your hearing, your sight, go hungry, break a bone, lose all your friends, get leprosy. All kinds of nasty things happen to you if you damage this text. All right. Now you'll find there's this one very nice inscription where somebody came by and decided to damage the text. He started pounding out the guy's name and everything, but then he reaches the name of the god who's being invoked. And out of respect for the god, he didn't damage the god's name. And then he skips over it and starts damaging the rest of it. So you can see this guy was a bit pious, he was worried that the gods would perhaps be displeased with him if he damaged their name, see? And so there it is. Yeah.
Fascinating. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I do want to mention, though, before I forget, that on February 25th, Thursday, February 25th, Professor Al-Jallad's colleague, Professor Sean Anthony, who actually I see is here with us, will be giving a lecture on the historical Muhammad. So you don't want to miss that. It's going to be Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Should be an outstanding lecture, just like this lecture. Here we have another question. Referring to all these archaeological findings, what do you think about the concept of Jahiliyyah according to traditional Islamic understanding?
Well, I think there's probably not one. We can't say that there's one Jahiliyyah in traditional Islamic understanding, but it serves different purposes in different authors' hands. But in general, what I find particularly fascinating about the Islamic Jahiliyyah versus the ancient Arabia that we have investigated in this talk. There's a prolific polymath, Al-Hamdani, a Yemeni polymath who who wrote a lot on the history of ancient Yemen. He wrote on, the languages, cultural geography, was interested in the ancient kingdoms of Himyar and all these guys. And in one volume of his masterpiece, Iqlil, he has what we call a script chart, okay? A script chart where he gives the ancient Arabian alphabet, the local ancient Arabian alphabet, which we call the Musnad, and the Arabic equivalents. And he gets them right. He gets them right. I mean, and of course, there are actually inscriptions from the 10th century, paleographically, where Arabic speakers from the area still know this alphabet and are using it to write their names. Fascinating. So they know the alphabet, they know the script. Now, what's more remarkable to me than that, for me, that maybe isn't so remarkable. What's remarkable to me is that he had this knowledge of the inscriptions, but what Al-Hamdani never really tried to do in a serious way was try to decipher all the inscriptions around him. He never tried to bring that knowledge and his great erudition, understanding of Arabic. And of course, these reflexes of these languages were still being spoken in Yemen, Himyaritic and all this. He never brought that knowledge and tried to systematically study these languages, although he was interested in the past. He was interested in pre-Islamic Arabia. He was interested in ancient India, but he did not try to consult this material because I think what these folks were interested in more was folklore and storytelling and legends. And for them, the past was about storytelling. It was about legends and all of, and the examination of artifacts just didn't fit with that. That wasn't part of the way they were thinking about the past. And so although he had this knowledge, he didn't really attempt to decipher ancient South Arabian. He would have been able to. If Germans did it in the 19th century, he would have been able to. He had more, I mean, he had everything he needed to do so, but the interest wasn't there. And so I would say that the Jahiliyyah is an interest in pre-Islamic Arabia that is concerned with oral traditions and folklore and legends. This is the material that these people are drawing from to construct their image of the past. And the goals of the Jahiliyyah change from text to text. It serves different goals, right? So when you read, for example, Ibn al-Kalbi's Kitab al-Asnam, for him, the Jahiliyyah serves as a way to explain how polytheism emerged, right? It's a way for him, he constructs a Jahiliyyah that allows him to explain the emergence of polytheism, right? How did people go from being monotheistic to polytheistic? That's the purpose of his Jahiliyyah, right? So it's very different than what we would call ancient Arabia and the study of ancient Arabia. It's a very different thing. Mm-hmm.
You touched on this briefly, but I wonder, what is the state of excavations in Mecca and Medina today?
Well, you can't excavate. I mean, these are cities where people live, so it's not. You can't excavate there proper. Unfortunately, I mean, you know, it's quite. You would have to like tear up people's houses, and in fact, if you think of all the construction, the foundations that one digs to build these buildings, have already destroyed everything that's under there. But what does exist and what requires attention is, you see all the mountains surrounding these places. That's rock. And where you have rock, you have inscriptions. Those need to be combed over because you could find all kinds of things. So I've seen, and there are all kinds of treasures just waiting to be discovered, I'm sure. And also, I've said this many times, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a good intuition because it's based on other findings. Where you also have mountains, you have caves. And people tend to hide things in caves. You know, we know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is there an Arabian version of this out there? Right. These are possibilities, exciting possibilities, and we will see. I mean, there will be this will be what people will be looking for the next century. Mm-hmm.
And are people able to go there and actually excavate?
Oh yeah, I mean, they're able to explore. I mean, like we said about excavation there, but in other sites like Madai and Saleh, you have excavations. Dumat al-Jandal, you have excavations. So yeah, no, Saudi Arabia is very supportive of that, of course. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we have here, thank you so much for an amazing topic in the comments. And I will maybe just throw out one more question if you don't mind.
Yeah, please, as many as you like.
This is a fascinating area of research. I wonder if you could tell us what led you to this.
Oh,
I know it's a big question.
God, I don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you what's fascinating about it's sort of when you start the nice thing about this material in general is that there's so much new to discover. So if you like discovery, if you like exploration, we're at the state of the field where, for example, Egyptology was in the late 19th and the late 18th and the 19th century. Think about the moment where the hieroglyphs where hieroglyphic script is finally deciphered. The Egyptian language can be read. Think about everything that's available to learn, right? Thousands of years of human history opened up again, lost forever and opened up again. So we're at that point with Arabia right now, right? Lots of these scripts there are scripts still being deciphered as we speak. There are lots of these inscriptions discovered. Like I said, I was walking, I stepped on an inscription, dug it up, and it happened to be this incredible text, right? So this is one of the only places, you just walk around and you make discoveries, and it's challenging because, we don't have living traditions that help us understand this material. We can't. So to put this in context, we talked about the Qasidas and the Sabaic inscriptions. Think about if we had one of the mu'allaqas, in the Arabic script, in the defective Arabic script inscribed on a rock. But think about if the Arabic language disappeared, didn't survive, and we had no commentary tradition on it, and you discover a mu'allaqa. How would you try to understand what it means? You would be lost. But that's the fascinating challenge, isn't it? That's the thing that motivates, right? Because it is possible to understand. These were produced by human minds. They were produced by people in an environment that we can ultimately relate to, right? We are the same. We are the same. So, so the drive to try to unlock that is something that you know, keeps you going. I don't know how I got here, but it certainly keeps you going. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for fielding these questions. Thank you for an outstanding, fascinating lecture. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us on this webinar. And that's it. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you again, Professor Ahmad Al-Jallad.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.